to some degree last week, the wisdom and tact of this woman as she approaches David. She first of all puts all the blame on herself. Of course, she wasn't at fault, but she takes the blame anyway. She basically says, well, I should have been there. I should have interceded. And by that takes on the blame herself, even though of course it wasn't her fault. She agrees with David. Yes, my husband's being a foolish man. He is a fool. She tries, as we've pointed out, she tries to present the situation to David from God's point of view, and kind of making it clear to him that what he's about to do or what he's considering doing is really going to be detrimental to him in the future. This isn't what God wants you to do, David. This isn't how you want to be known. And you will regret this later. Yes, you'll get a moment of revenge, maybe a moment of satisfaction from taking your rage out on this nitwit, if you will. But in the end, you're going to be, it's going to be a sadness to you, because you're going to know that you overreacted. You're going to know that you blew up and committed this act in a rash moment, and you'll regret it later. She acknowledges him as the Lord's anointed, that he is the future king of Israel. She makes kind of a reference to, we talked about this a little bit, she makes something of a reference to his victory over Goliath. She doesn't mention it directly, but she talks about the use of a sling and about slinging out against the enemies of God. And certainly that's got to have been tugging a little bit on David's memory, maybe on David's ego, just a little bit, and acknowledging him as a hero. I mean, you are a hero of Israel. Heroes of Israel don't do these things, if you will. I think that was part of the idea that she was trying to present to him. And just as God led you to use a sling against Goliath and slung out your enemies, he's going to continue to sling out your enemies, and continue to make use of that emblem, that visual for David, as a way of persuading him to turn away from what he's about to do. And so we see again in this woman a great deal of courage and a great deal of tact, a great deal of diplomacy. David, we find out he hears these words. He hears these words and speaks kindly to her. Verse 32. Verse 32, then David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you to me this day, and blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who had restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left in Nabal until the morning so much as one male." And again, we talked about the terminology that David uses here it's not this sort of kind of cleaned up and antiseptic language that we find here in the English translation. The terminology David uses is much more crude and is indicative of the fact of his anger, of his tremendous anger, and said, "So David received from her hand what she had brought to him and said to her, 'Go up to your house in peace. See, I've listened to you and granted your request.'" And so by her actions, this wise woman, this very wise, very tactful woman, has averted what would have been for her household a disaster, and probably what would have been for David a disaster. In the end, I think it would have been a disaster for David, because this would have put him perhaps at odds with a great many of his own people in his own nation. It would have been a scandal at least, and a crime at the at the worst, and he would have damaged, very, very badly damaged his standing with the people, and made it more difficult for him in the future when he would be coming into being king. From here now, we see though that Abigail now returns back and speaks to her husband. Verse 36, when Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. We had talked about earlier how there's a number of parallels that are drawn between Nabal and Saul. And there is an effort, I think, on the part of the writer to make Nabal sort of a surrogate of Saul. That may help explain some of David's anger, that here is Nabal enjoying the comforts of home. Here's Nabal enjoying essentially the fruits of David's labor. You know, David has kept his flock safe. David has kept his household safe. And here's Nabal obviously enjoying himself at basically at David's expense. And in the same way, we see something of this with Saul. Saul too had enjoyed the fruits of David's victories. You know, David had beaten Goliath, but it was Saul who reaped the benefit of that. David had been successful against the Philistines, and because of that, Saul had enjoyed prosperity in his kingdom. And so, again, we find here this substitution, if you will, I think on the part of the author, a substitution, or at least this parallel. Here's Nabal kind of presented as a surrogate of Saul. And, David is unwilling to take out his wrath on Saul because, again, Saul's a friend. Saul's his father-in-law. Saul is the anointed of the Lord. All of these things are staying David's hand. And yet here comes Nabal, who treats David like dirt, just as frankly as Saul has treated David like dirt. And just you can imagine that rage boiling up. David's ready to take him out. And so here we find Nabal, and Nabal's back at home, oblivious to just how close disaster was to him. He's just oblivious. He has no clue. And he says he's holding a feast like the feast of a king, and you can imagine what that would have been like. The quantities of food and drink, and the quality of the food and the drink. And it would have been a grand time. They would have been having a grand time. And it says here, Nabal's heart was merry in him, for he was very drunk. He wasn't just, a little bit. He was very drunk. And she did not tell him anything at all until the morning light. So, yeah, what are you going to go in? You're going to go in and try and argue with a drunk? You're going to waste your time. You don't go in and try and argue with someone who's in this kind of state. You don't try and point out to somebody who's in the middle of this, hey, do you know how close you came to getting killed? No, it's a waste of time. They won't even comprehend what you're saying. They're that, apparently Nabal was that far gone. It just would not have registered with him. So it's been it came about in the morning when the wine had gone out of Nabal, maybe when he's a little hungover, that his wife told him all these things, and his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. There's a thought here by some of the commentators that there's a play on words here, because it talks about the wine going out of him, and there is a Hebrew word that is used called the Hebrew word for wineskin is nebel, which obviously is very close to Nabal. And so you see a little bit of a play on words here where the wine had gone out of him. The idea that the author here is treating Nabal as if he is nothing more than an empty wineskin. Yeah, now that the wine's poured out of him, there's nothing left. There's nothing left of him. He's just nothing more than an empty wineskin. Abigail, his wife, informs him, hey, did you realize David was on his way down here with 400 men and was going to kill everybody here? Everybody, including you, especially you? Did you realize that? And it not only does she catch him at a time when now he's kind of recovering from the effects of his bacchanal, but just shocks and scares the fire out of him. And there is a state, there is a medical state, this is a medical term called catatonic depression, where people can become so shocked at events around them, they can become so frightened by events around them that they go into a state of what is called catatonic depression. They become unresponsive. We've talked about, you've heard people talk about, oh, well, he curled up in the fetal position. Well, folks, in this condition, that's what they tend to do. They just kind of curl up in a ball and they become unresponsive. And the commentators believe this is probably what happened with Nabal, that he is so shocked, he is so terrified by this close brush with death, realizing now that he's made a very powerful enemy, that he goes into this kind of state of shock. And as it says here, and about 10 days, he became as a stone, it says here. He became as a stone. Folks in this state literally become unresponsive. They don't eat, they don't drink, they don't talk, they just lay there. It is a catatonic shock. As it says here, and about 10 days later, it happened that the Lord struck Nabal and he died. And it talks about, yes, folks, in this condition, system failure is not uncommon. And so we don't know exactly what that system failure might have been. Could have been like a heart attack, could have been like a stroke, could have been just his body shut down. But the bottom line here is that Nabal dies now 10 days. Here again, we see the providence of God, that David, who was about to kill this man dies anyway 10 days later. And so in the end, God avenges David. David doesn't have to do it himself. From there, then, David decides to take Abigail as a wife. Verse 39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil. So see, David has had time to think about it. David's had time to consider and realize, yes, Abigail's right. If I take vengeance out of my own hand, it's going to be bad for me. But now he's grateful because here is God. God has pled. God has heard his plea. God has heard the case, and God has made the decision. And so David's hands are clean. It says, the Lord has returned the evil doing of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent a proposal to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, David has sent us to you to take you as his wife. And she arose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold, your maidservant is a maid to wash the feet of my Lord's servants. Then Abigail rose quickly and rode on a donkey with her 5 maidens who attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David had also taken Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both became his wives. Now Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. A lot of things going on here. Of course, David here is already married. He's already married to 2 other women. He's married, of course, to Michal, who is Saul's wife, Saul's daughter. He's also married, as it says here, to this other woman, Ahinoam, who is from Jezreel. So he's got 2 wives already, and now he's adding a third. As we find out, first of all, this was against the David really was not supposed to be doing this. The book of Deuteronomy forbade the king to take on multiple wives, and yet here's David doing it anyway. And polygamy, we will find that polygamy is going to be a major source of grief to David later in his life. We probably already know the storyline of what happens with David, and realize that, yes, that polygamy that he engages in becomes a major stumbling block, a major downfall for him later in his life. And then we find here that Saul has given Michal, his wife, to another man. Well, why would Saul do that? And this again shows us something of the irreligious nature of Saul. You know, here Saul would have known David's still alive. He would have known that Michal's his wife. He would have known that giving Michal to another man is putting her into an adulterous relationship. A relationship that could be condemned, that was condemned in the Old Testament. And yet here is Saul putting his own daughter into that condition by pushing her into off onto another man. This shows us a lot of things. First of all, it shows us. First of all, it does show us here is Saul's irreligious nature on full display. I mean, you don't conduct your life this way. You don't put your daughter in this situation if you have any kind of religious morality about you at all. You just don't do that. Second of all, we see that Saul here, in spite of the promises that he has made to David about keeping David alive and leaving David and leaving David to live his life, Saul has no intention of fulfilling any of those promises. He has no intention, because he already considers David essentially as good as dead. Otherwise, he would not have given his daughter to this other man. And so there's this ongoing hatred that Saul has for David, in spite of the fact that Saul does a lot of lip service about, oh yes, David, you're my son, you're my brother, you're my son-in-law, you're the anointed one, and I'll make promises and I'll make vows with you. But in the end, we find out that Saul doesn't mean any of it. And again, we see something of the deeply irreligious nature of this man. Okay? Any questions or comments other on chapter 25? Go ahead, Bill. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, here in verse 14, you see how the story comes back to Abigail from these shepherds going, we did talk about that a little bit. We did talk about how, they had made the point that, hey, there's these men, they've been doing a lot of good things for us. These men showed up and asked for a gift, and Nabal basically told them to get lost. And these shepherds are knowing full well the benefit that they have received from David and his men. You're right there. And that's how I think Abigail finds out about it, is these, and we find out, we did talk about too, notice that these shepherds, they go to Abigail. They don't go to Nabal and try to argue with him or reason with him or explain. No, apparently he can't be approached for whatever reason. I don't know if he's got a foul temper or what, but he can't be approached. He's unreasonable. That's what these fellas ultimately say, is he's unreasonable. And so they turn to her, and apparently she is the one who is perhaps in some degree the perhaps the only person there that can approach him at all. Yes. Yeah. All right, we go from there then into chapter 26 and find it once again. Here comes Saul, in spite of his promises, in spite of his recognition of David. Here he comes after David again. It says, then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding in the hills of Hashelah, which is before Jezreel? And so here we see that here's the Ziphites again trying to integrate themselves with Saul, try to curry favor with Saul by basically ratting David out, if you will, and apparently, instead of Saul saying, no, I've made an agreement with David, I've made a covenant with David, I'm not going after him. No, instead it's Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having with him 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search for David in the wilderness of Ziph. And so here comes Saul again. And Saul camped on the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jezreel, beside the road, and David was staying in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies, and he knew that Saul was definitely coming. David then arose and came to the place where Saul had camped, and David saw the place where Saul lay, and Abner the son of Ner, the commander of his army, and Saul were lying in the circle of the camp, and the people were camped around him. Again, some Bible critics will try to point to this account and notice the similarities between this account and the account in verse 24, and they'll try to say, well, this is simply a retelling of the same account. Well, no, there are plenty of differences here. There are, yes, a few similarities. There are a few things that are parallel with what happened in chapter 24, but this event in chapter 26 clearly is a standalone event. It clearly is a separate event and shows how David spared Saul's life not once, but twice. 2 times David has him in his hand, and 2 times David lets him go. Saul again out here traveling with his 3,000 men. This was apparently the size of the body of the army that went with him everywhere he went. This was his sort of a standing army. But David's got some 600 men, but with 3,000 men, David is outnumbered, 5 to 1. And so not in a way that he can fight. So he's going to try and evade from Saul whenever he can. David here, he sends out his scouts. There is some thought here that David may have been reluctant, to believe that Saul's coming after him. After all, Saul had just made all these promises back here at the end of chapter 24 that he's going to leave David alone. And David may have actually believed, David wants to believe the best of Saul. He really does. And yet here comes Saul again coming after him, and David sends out his scouts, and they report, yes, it's Saul, and yes, he's coming after you. And so here they are, and David can go over and see where they're camping. He can kind of observe them where they are. It says, then David answered and said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, saying, who will go down with me to Saul in the camp? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping in the circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head, and Abner and the people were lying around him. Then Abishai said to David, today the God has delivered the enemy to your hand. Now therefore, please let me strike him with the spear to the ground with 1 stroke, and I will not strike him a second time. David gathers up his council of war. He's got this man named Ahimelech, who is probably a Hittite mercenary. there are two of them mentioned in Samuel. And then he's also got with him Abishai. And Abishai is the son of his sister, so it's his nephew. And they go, the two of them, and they go and they go and slip into the camp. Notice that Abishai proposes, let's kill Saul. They get right up on Saul. There he is with his spear right there in the ground next to him. And as Abishai says, I'll strike him to the ground in one stroke, and I will not strike him the second time. Why? If I hit him once, he won't need to be hit twice. It's the idea that, I'll kill him. I'll kill him the first time. But we see here what David says. And here in verses 9 through 11, this is really a great statement. This is really a great statement about a man. Here's a man with great faith in God who's willing to wait for God. Who, he knows what God has promised. He knows what God has said about what's going to happen, and has had plenty of opportunity to take things into his own hand. And yet David here has got the wisdom to wait for God. Sometimes that can be hard. Sometimes it's difficult for us to wait for God to take care of things. But if we have trust in God, we know that he will. In verse 9, David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? David also said, as the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed, but please now take the spear that is at his head and the jug of water, and let us go. There are several things here. First of all, it's not our job to take action, but to wait for God. Let's look over at Proverbs 20 and verse 22. Proverbs 20 and verse 22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will save you. And so there was wisdom here in what David says. There was wisdom here that, it's easy for us sometimes to want to take our own vengeance. It's easy for us sometimes to want to move ourselves, even if we understand that God is with us. That we get ourselves in a hurry to see God's will fulfilled. And the real answer is sometimes we have to be patient. Sometimes we have to just be patient and wait for what God wants. We see too, though, that David here does not pass responsibility over to Abishai. As he says here, in verse 10, I think, or 11, he said, Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand. David understands that even if Abishai actually commits the actual act of killing Saul, it's at David's permission. It's at David's direction. And it's David's fault. It's David's responsibility. And so there is that thought that here is David recognizing that, yes, I can't send my agent to do it and still be guiltless. It'll still be my fault because he's my agent. And therefore I'd still be responsible. So what do they take? They take Saul's spear and they take his jug of water. And there's some thought there that, especially among the commentators, there's some thought there that this is very symbolic, because the spear was the symbol of Saul's power. Saul always had that spear with him. When you read, you find out that he nearly always had that spear with him. It was a symbol of his authority. It was a symbol of his kingship. And so in that sense, here David is taking that symbol of authority away from him. The other thing he takes is a water jug. Well, why a water jug? Well, this is still a somewhat arid land. It's a dry land. There's not a lot of water, and water is a fairly precious commodity. Water is life and death in a lot of cases to these folks. And by taking that water jug, David is basically showing Saul, I have the power of life and death. I have that power of life and death. I'm taking your water away from you, which is the power of life and death. And basically making that statement to Saul of saying, see, your life is in my hand. So David now then again confronts Saul, verse 13. When David crossed over the other side, he stood on a mountain, on the top of the mountain at a distance with a large area between them. Notice, if you remember the first time, David kind of followed Saul out of the cave and spoke to him probably at a distance, that was not terribly great, maybe less than 100 yards. Speaks to him from the mouth of the cave where Saul had been. He's not going to take that chance again. This time he goes to basically the adjoining mountain, and shouts out to him, calls out to him, shouts out to Abner, actually, from the adjoining mountain. He says to Abner, David called out to the people and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered and said, who is it you who calls to the king? Well, David wasn't calling to the king. The language here is, who is it that's disturbing the king? Maybe they were still asleep, and this is going to wake Saul up. All this shouting, at this time of the night or early morning, whenever it is. So David said to Abner, are you not a man? And who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not guarded the Lord your king? For one of the people came to destroy the king your Lord. This thing which you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, all of you must surely die, because you did not guard the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and the jug of water that is at his head. Here is David. David yells over at Abner, hey, Abner. And he starts off with a compliment. He says, who's like you in Israel? Why, you're one of the leading commanders of Israel. Who's like you? You have a position of great power, a position of great responsibility. And why? Because you're able to faithfully execute that position of power and authority. You're one of Saul's friends, one of his most trusted generals. You're a man of great ability. And yet look what happened. You didn't protect the king. You deserve to die, Abner, because you didn't do your job. Your job is to protect the king, and you didn't protect the king. He says, there was a man that came into that camp who was ready to slay him tonight, and you didn't protect him adequately. You weren't there. And then he asked him, where's the king's spear, Abner? Where's the king's water jug, Abner? As if to kind of grind it home. And sure enough, David is certainly going to do that. David is certainly going to show Abner the folly of what he's allowed to happen by pointing out, look around. You see a spear? Nope. Why not? Because I got it. Look around. Where's his water jug? Do you see it? No. You know why? Because I got it. Because I was right there. And David knows that this sleep that has fallen on these men, it came from God. And he knew that this deep sleep is the hand of God. But he uses the words. He's trying to show Abner, look, you're faithful to the Lord. You're faithful to the king. You're the king's faithful servant, his faithful bodyguard. But guess what? I'm more faithful to the king. I'm better. Because when I had an opportunity to take and attack Saul, I didn't do it. When I had an opportunity to take his life, and when another man had an opportunity to take his life, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And so I've done a better job of protecting Saul than you have. You who are his top commander, you are his good friend, and I've done a better job protecting him than you have. And so that's the intent. This is a message not just for Abner, of course, but it's also intended for Saul to hear. Saul is supposed to hear this. Saul answers. Then Saul recognized David's voice and said, is it your voice, my son David? And David said, it is my voice, my lord the king. He also said, why then is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? or what evil is in my hand? Now, therefore, please let the king listen to the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, let him accept an offering. But if it is of men, cursed are they before the Lord, for they have driven me out today, that I should have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now then, do not let my blood fall to the ground, away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out as to search for a single flea, just as one hunts a partridge in the mountains. Saul addresses David as my son. He still responds to he still considers him my son, even though he's given his daughter over to another man. David responds not by calling him my father. Notice he doesn't call him that anymore. He calls him, but he does still show respect. He still calls him my Lord the King. Still recognizes his authority, still recognizes his position. And now he puts to Saul the same questions he had put to Jonathan. If you remember back a few chapters before, when he had talked with Jonathan, there in chapter 20, I think it was, that he had asked Jonathan, in chapter 20 and verse 1, what have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life? He asked that of Jonathan. And Jonathan, of course, then ended up and asks that even of his own father in verse 32, why should he be put to death? What has he done? And Saul, instead of answering, tries to kill his own son, if you recall. And now here's David asking the question point blank to Saul. And once again, we find out that Saul doesn't have an answer. There is no answer. When every time Saul is asked, what have I done? For what reason are you hunting me? And Saul can't answer that question. Saul can't answer that question. He's just unwilling. He knows what the answer is, of course. He knows what the answer is, but he won't answer it. And again, we see something of the irreligious nature of Saul. We see something of that arrogance, that ego, that he can't bear to come to grips with the fact that he's out chasing down a man who hasn't done anything wrong. And he just really can't come to grips with it. He really can't handle it. Notice then we notice David's arguments. David's argument is, if I've somehow offended you, if I've somehow offended the Lord, rather, if I somehow offended Jehovah, I'll make an atonement. Let me know what I've done, and I'll make an atonement. But he says, if this is coming from men, if someone's whispering against me, if someone is trying to turn your mind away from me, because David doesn't know. David doesn't know where else is coming from. He suspects maybe some sort of court intrigue or something like that. If that's the case, God, or if that's the case, Saul, then they ought to be cursed, Saul, because what they're doing is they're trying to drive me away from the Lord, and they're trying to drive me toward other gods. David obviously isn't able to go up and worship at the tabernacle. He's obviously not able to go and offer sacrifices and the other observances of the Old Testament law as he's supposed to, because clearly if he goes into that area, Saul's going to have him. We'll have him immediately. And finally, David points out to him, saying, what you're trying to do here is very unkingly, okay? You're out here beating the bushes like a man might beat the bushes for a partridge, like a bird hunt. Well, that's not the king doesn't go out and kind of beat the bushes himself, to go bird hunting. When over in England, when Prince Charles or any of the Prince Harry and those guys want to go hunting, I can almost guarantee you they're not the ones out there beating the bushes trying to get the birds up. They've got plenty of servants that'll do that. and they're more than happy to stand there and be taking pot shots at the birds, but it's the servants that are the ones that are actually kind of beating the bushes. And yet here's David saying, you're out here beating the bushes for me. This isn't the role of a king. This isn't how a king behaves. This isn't how a king conducts his life. You're wasting time with me. That's what David is trying to say here. You're wasting time with me. Why are you doing that? And so we see David's arguments here in this case as he's trying to plead with Saul, don't be doing this. The last section of this chapter, Saul will again repent for what it's worth. Verse 21, then Saul said, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will not harm you again, because my life was precious in your sight this day. Behold, I have played the fool and have committed a serious error. David answered and said, behold, the spear of the king, now let one of the young men come over and take it. Number of things that are going on here. First of all, we see Saul calls David my son, but that action is entirely hypocritical. There's an hypocrisy here. As he speaks to David about my son, he doesn't apologize. He never apologizes. You're right. You're right, David. He does say I've done wrong. I've done wrong, but he never apologizes to David. He never says to David, I'm sorry. He never says that directly to David. He never indicates what he's done to David is wrong. He turns all the attention again to himself. It's the Saul pity party once again. He says, I have erred, I have played the fool, but there's no apology. There's no sense of remorse. I think we maybe don't pick that up in the text, but David certainly apparently picked it up, that there was no remorse. There's no reaching out to David. There's no attempt to reach out and ask David's forgiveness. David tells him of the events in the camp, how he could have easily been killed. He even gives him his spear back. This is again that symbol of Saul's authority. I'm going to give you your spear back. Verse 23, the Lord will repay each man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I refuse to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. And again, there's that reference to the Lord's anointed. Well, that's Saul. Yes, he's the Lord's anointed, but David was the Lord's anointed too. And there's a subtlety here where David is saying, I didn't reach out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Why are you trying to reach out your hand against the Lord's anointed? It says, now therefore, behold, as your life was highly valued in my sight this day, so may my life be highly valued in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me from all distress. And Saul said to David, blessed are you, my son David. You will both accomplish much and surely prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. And so you see, once again, here's an opportunity for reconciliation. Here's an opportunity for these two men to come to terms of peace. And yet Saul just can't, Saul, first of all, just can't do it. And David, wisely, just can't trust Saul. Just can't trust him. I'm going to stop there. We'll continue on then with the next chapter next week. Thank you for your attention.